Hello, welcome to the Self Learning Podcast by Dr. Sushma Singh. Let us start discussion on Chapter 5 Patterns of Social Inequality and Exclusion. And our topic is Struggle for Women's Equality and Rights. Because of the obvious biological and political differences between men and women, gender inequality is often treated as natural. However, despite appearances, scholars have shown that the inequalities between men and women are social rather than natural. For example, there are no biological reasons that can explain why so few women are found in positions of public power, nor can nature explain why women generally receive a smaller or no share in family property in most societies. But the strongest argument comes from the societies that were different from the normal or common pattern. If women were biologically unfit to be inheritors and heads of families, how did matrilineal societies, as the Nayars of Kerala used to be, and as the Khasis of Meghalaya still are, work for centuries? How have women managed to be successful farmers and traders in so many African societies? There is, in short, nothing biological about the inequalities that mark the relations between women and men. Gender is thus also a form of social inequality and exclusion, like caste and class, but with its own specific features. In this section, we will look at how gender inequality came to be recognized as inequality in the Indian context and the kinds of responses that this recognition produced. The women's question arose in modern India as part of the 19th century middle class social reform movements. The nature of these movements varied from region to region. They are often termed as middle class reform movements because many of these reformers were from the newly emerged Western educated Indian middle class. They were often at once inspired by the democratic ideas of the modern West and by a deep pride in their own democratic traditions of the past. Many used both these resources to fight for women's rights. We can only give illustrative examples here. We draw from the Anti-Sati Campaign led by Raja Ram Mohan Roy in Bengal, the widow remarriage movement in the Bombay Presidency, where Ranade was one of the leading reformers, from Jyotiba Phule's stimulatious attack on caste and gender oppression, and from the social reform movements in Islam led by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. Rajaram Mohan Rai's attempt to reform society, religion, and the status of women can be taken as the starting point of 19th century social reform in Bengal. A decade before establishing the Brahmo Samaj in 1828, Roy undertook the campaign against Sati, which was the first women's issue to receive public attention. Rajaram Mohan Rai's idea presented a curious mixture of Western rationality and an assertion of Indian traditionality. Both trends can be located in the overarching context of a response to colonialism. Ram Mohan Roy thus attacked the practice of sati on the basis of both appeals to humanitarian and the natural rights doctrines as well as Hindu Shastras. The deplorable and unjust treatment of the Hindu upper caste widows was a major issue taken up by the social reformers. Renard used the writings of the scholars such as Bishop Joseph Butler, whose analogy of religion and the three sermons on human nature dominated the moral philosophy syllabus of Bombay University in the 1860s. At the same time, M.G. Renard writings entitled The Text of the Hindu Law on the Lawfulness of the Remarriage of Widows and Vedic Authorities for Widow Remarriage elaborated the Shastric sanction for remarriage of widows. While Renard and Ram Manohar Rai belonged to one kind of 19th century upper caste and middle caste social reformers, Jyotiba Phule came from a socially excluded caste, and his attack was directed against both caste and gender discrimination. He founded the Satya Shodhak Samaj with its primary emphasis on truth seeking. Phule's first practical social reform efforts were to aid the two groups considered lowest in the traditional Brahmin culture, women and untouchables. As in the case of other reformers, a similar trend of drawing upon both modern Western ideas as well as the sacred text characterized Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's efforts to reform Muslim society. He wanted girls to be educated, but within the precinct of their homes, like Dayanand Saraswati of Arya Samaj. He stood for women's education, but sought for a curriculum that included instruction in religious principles, training in the arts of housekeeping and handicrafts, and rearing of children. This may appear very stereotypical today. One has to, however, realize that once rights such as education for women was accepted, it started a process that finally made it impossible to confine women to only some kinds of education. It is often assumed that the social reform for women's rights were entirely fought for by male reformers, and that ideas of women's equality are alien imports. To learn how wrong both these assumptions are, stress purush Tlana or comparison of men on women was written by a Maharashtrian housewife, Tarabai Shinde, as a protest against the double standards of a male dominated society. A young Brahmin widow had been sentenced to death by the court for killing her newborn baby because it was illegitimate. But no effort had been made to identify or punish the man who had fathered the baby. Stri Purush Tulna created quite a stir when it was published. Begum Ruqayya Shekhawat Hussain was born in a well-to-do Bengali Muslim family and was lucky to have a husband who was very liberal in outlook and encouraged her education first in Urdu and later in Bengali and English. She was already a successful author in Urdu and Bengali when she wrote Sultana's Dream to test her ability in English. This remarkable short story is probably the earliest example of science fiction writing in India and among the first by a woman author anywhere in the world. In her dream, Sultana visits a magical country where the gender roles are reversed. Men are confined to the home and observe parda, while the women are busy scientists aiming with each others at inventing devices that will control the clouds and regulate rain, and machines that fly or air cars. Apart from the early feminist vision, there were a large number of women's organizations that arose both at the all India and local levels in the early 20th century, and then began to participation of women in the national movement itself. Not surprisingly, women's rights were part and parcel of the nationalist vision. In 1931, the Karachi session of Indian National Congress issued a declaration on the fundamental rights of citizenship in India, whereby it committed itself to women's equality. The declaration reads as: all citizens are equal before the law, irrespective of religion, caste, creed, or sex. No disability attaches to any citizen by reason of his or her religion, caste, creed, or sex. In regard to public employment, office of power or honor, and in the exercise of any trade or calling. The franchise shall be on the basis of universal adult suffrage. Women shall have the right to vote, to represent, and the right to hold public offices. 2 decades after independence, women's issues re-emerged in 1970s. In the 19th century reform movements, the emphasis had been on the backward aspect of tradition like sati, child marriage, or the ill treatment of widows. In the 1970s, the emphasis was on modern issues: the rape of women in police custody, dowry murders, the representation of women in popular media, and the gendered consequences of unequal development. The law was a major site for reform in the 1980s and after, especially when it was discovered that many laws of concern to women had not been changed since the 19th century. As we enter the 21st century, new sites of gender injustice are emerging. You will recall the discussion of declining sex ratio, the sharp fall in the child sex ratio, and the implicit social biases against the girl child represents one of the new challenges of gender inequality. Social change, whether on women's rights or any other issue, is never a battle won once and for all. As with other social issues, the struggle is long, and the women's movement in India will have to fight to defend hard won rights as well as take up new issues as they emerge. Now, let us wind up the session and thank you very much for engaging yourself with the Self Learning Podcast.